My name is Þóra Arnórsdóttir. I'm an Icelandic journalist, and I'm going to be the moderator for this panel discussion on the theme of peace and security. This part of the theme, this is called the A part, which we do this morning. Then the B part will be taken on in the afternoon. What we're going to do here in this session is to focus on the issues, the challenges, and the present status of the theme. We know that the systematic violence against women in war times is a war strategy that reflects a general culture of violence, and in spite of Resolution 1325, women are very often excluded from the peace process, from the rebuilding, and all the negotiation that happens after a conflict and during a conflict solution. So what these three experts are going to do, they are going to tell us how things are now. Why are we doing this? Well, it's been almost 20 years since the UN held its 4th Women's Conference in Beijing, when the world's governments took up the platform for action, which was the outcome of that conference. So the Nordic women's organizations decided it was time, that they weren't going to wait any longer for the UN or what was going to happen there, but to push forward, to make a milestone and take a look at evaluate the present situation and take a look at the future. Just a couple of practical things, because there has been made a draft of the final paper. If you want to add something, if there's something that comes to mind, if you feel that something is missing, you can see the draft online. You can just take a piece of paper there, write your idea or your comment, and give it to Jón, which is our rapporteur. He takes down anything really intelligent these women say during the session and is missing from the draft. And then on Saturday, the text committee is going to put it all together, and it's going to be presented on Sunday. Now, I know it says in the program that this session is to be in Scandinavian. However, one of our speakers, her working language is English, and I'm pretty sure we don't want her to speak Icelandic. For me, it's enough of a challenge to speak Scandinavian, but to switch from Finnish, Swedish to Norwegian to English was kind of too much. So I kindly ask for your permission to have the session in English, if that is okay for everyone. So, the current situation. That's these three women that we have here have a hands-on experience. They actually can interpret and tell us about the gap between the text, the rhetoric, the theory, the demands, how we would like to have the world, and tell us how far that is away from the current situation. What is actually going on? How far have we actually got? Here on my furthest left to your furthest right is Torunn Tryggestad, a Norwegian researcher and project leader at the Peace Research Institute of Oslo, PRIO. Torunn has conducted research on the Women, Peace and Security agenda since 2006, with a special emphasis on the UN. And she was one of the co-authors of the Norwegian government's National Action Plan on Resolution 1325, and is a political scientist. Here in the center is Ingibjörg Sólrún Gísladóttir. She is the Regional Director of UN Women for Europe and Central Asia, located in Istanbul, and the former Minister of Foreign Affairs in Iceland. And here next to me is Tarja Kronberg, from the Greens of Finland, a member of the European Parliament. Now first, I'd like to ask you, each and every one, to give us like a 5-minute startup, your first thoughts, and then we'll just let the conversation flow a bit. The last 10 minutes or so, 10, 15 minutes maybe, we take questions from the public. So please, if there's something that comes to mind, try to keep it there, write it down, and they will happily answer your questions at the end. So Tarja, if you would start.
Is this on? Okay. I would like to also add maybe to the presentation that I used to be the director for the Copenhagen Peace Research Institute, so I'm also with a research background and not only a politician in this field. But I would like to first start with a question, since I'm the first. Why is it important that women are participating in the peace process? There's always the equality aspect, of course, which is generally, democracy and so forth. But there's also this content-wise, which I think we all acknowledge, that it's a question of the women's everyday life. The way wars are carried out today actually mean that the everyday life is disrupted in the whole country. And this affects women's lives. And I think one of the key words, if I was to mention one key word about the peace process or the women's situation under armed conflicts, is order. Order is good for women, and disorder is very bad for women and children. And actually disorder creates conditions for human trafficking, for sexual violence, and also questions for girls not being able to go to schools. Also disorder perpetuates the war, because there's a war economy that will be created. But just a few comments on the participation of women in the peace process. I think for me the most important part is conflict prevention. And this is the case where we are very, very bad. We cannot prevent conflicts. We see this in Ukraine. And actually the situation is that the women often are the first to see the emerging conflicts. And this should in somehow be used more than it is today. This is really the gap. The resolution talks about preventing conflicts, but is not using the women that actually see the conflicts first. There are two things that happen in a society where you have the conflicts. One is there's increased militarization, and secondly, there's usually things that affect women's lives, such, for example, interracial marriage is often prohibited. So this kind of early warning signals should be taken into account. The second question is then, when you finally have this kind of peace process, of course it's important that women participate, but how do they get access, and what women should participate? We had recently in the European Union has been very active in trying to promote the Syrian women's participation in peace negotiations about Syrian conflict. And here there were recently Geneva negotiations, and actually the European Union requested that women be present at the discussions, and they did come. They came, but they were the wrong women. They were the government's women rather than the civil society. They were not women from the refugee camps and people who actually were involved in the conflicts. And there is a very good paper by a number of women's organizations called Ensuring the Effective Participation of Women and Women's Rights in the Syrian Peace and Mediation Process. It talks about women participation, getting access, reports on women's situation, and all this is very good. But there is this gap that the government decides, the Syrian government decides who comes to the negotiations, and it's the government women. But you can take another example. You can take Ukraine, the conflict in Ukraine today. It's very interesting to look at it from the gender perspective, because the two dominant persons in creating the conflict, secondly in managing the conflict, are women. The High Representative from EU, Catherine Ashton, and Angela Merkel. They are actually the two women who decide what's going on in this conflict from the European side. So in a way, I just want to raise with you the question that does the women's participating guarantee a change, and if it does, when and how. Finally, there's the question of the reconstruction and reconstructing societies after wars. And here the problem is how the reconstruction process is organized. The gap is really there because the international institutions come with funds, and a lot of money is flowing into the country like Afghanistan or later Syria also, and the money goes to building roads and establishing buildings and so forth, and it should actually go to everyday life things so that the everyday life is reconstructed. And once you reconstruct the everyday life, then you are also reconstructing the country. The roads are important, but they don't guarantee anything, and they usually mean that it's construction companies from the foreign fields who come and reconstruct. I think if you look at the reconstruction of Iraq, it was a terrible case of billions going to big American companies who were actually trying to secure security and were part of the problem rather than being part of the solution. So I think this is important that we create channels and also funding mechanisms for the reconstruction period so that the money goes to the women's organizations, to the everyday life, and to those who can actually start schools for girls. And finally, a comment on this question of rape. The resolution names rape as one of the things that you have to try to get all the parties involved to counteract that rape is used as a weapon in an armed conflict. And this is where there's been new resolutions saying that rape should be analyzed and we should know who does it and it should be prevented. But I think it's very important that rape is also prosecuted on all levels and that the International Criminal Court can also deal with the cases of systematic rape in armed conflict. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Whoa. Thank you very much, Tarja. Ingebjörg, you would be next.
I don't need to turn this on, or what?
It's on. I think it's obviously on.
Okay. Thank you, and thank you, all of you, to come here and listening to this discussion on women, peace, and security. I think this is a very relevant topic, actually, although maybe it's not the topic that is highest on the agenda when it comes to women's rights or women's empowerment. And the thing is that the area of peace and security is actually a very male-dominated area. And it has been so for quite a long time and still is, although we have come a long way. And when I say it's a very male-dominated area, then we all know that all the militaries they are built up by men. They are the management of the military, the leadership is male-dominated, and most of those who participate in let's say peace negotiation, peace what do we call it? Peace protecting, peace negotiation, peace and reconciliation are men. So women have not been very many in this area, but nonetheless, this is gradually changing. And we have been mentioning here the resolution 1325, and we tend sometimes, those of us who are very much in this area, we tend to talk about things just like everybody knows what is Security Council Resolution 1325. Not everybody knows what that is. But that was a resolution that was passed by the Security Council in the year 2000 and was a resolution on women, peace and security. And this was actually a groundbreaking resolution because it was the first time ever that the Security Council did pass a resolution on women, peace and security. And where they recognized that conflict affects women differently from men, and that they need to have that perspective when they are dealing with the issue of peace and security. that women are victimized in a different way than men, and it affects women differently from men. And this resolution is very much about how to protect women, how to prevent that crimes or violence against women happens in conflict, and also how to involve women in the peace processes and peace negotiation and reconciliation processes. So, and maybe the real spirit of this resolution was that it was reminding the Security Council that women's leadership is actually an untapped resource when it comes to peace. And that was really important to get this resolution. And we have seen some changes. We have, in spite of everything, we have seen some changes since 2000. And that's important to keep that in mind, because although we think things are happening too slowly and too little steps are taken, and even though we can say now that if we continue in the same pace as until now, we will not see major changes until the 22nd century. So we really need to speed up. But changes have happened, and we have seen some results from this resolution. And just to mention here some examples, because it's important to have this in mind, so we really believe and understand that it matters, that when we take steps like having this resolution from the Security Council, that in 2000, no one had been convicted for sexual violence crimes in conflict. But now, at least I think 80 have been convicted for that. So this has happened since 2000. In 2000, in 80% of refugee camps, they had not taken any measures to protect women or girls from gender-based violence. Now I think almost all refugee camps have done that. We can debate if they've done that successfully or not, but at least it has been addressed. We can also say that now most peace agreements, no, it's not right, not most, I think only 30% of peace agreements actually refer to women, have provisions on women. But before they didn't have it. So at least we can see these changes happening. But the steps are too small, and they are too few, and still there's if we look at the UN, then only like less than 10% of negotiators, peace negotiators, are women, if we count from the end of the Cold War. Only like 3% of the signatories of peace agreements are women. And when we take the peacekeeping missions or political missions of the UN, the leadership there, it's only by like 15% of them are women. So we still have a long way to go. And this area is very male dominated. So we see a lot of rhetoric from the international community on these things. Everybody is now talking about this. It's a very hot topic, violence against women in conflict, how to involve women in peace and the reconciliation processes. We had a conference just last week in UK on these issues. So the rhetoric is very much there, and the recognition is there, but it has still not been translated into action. And that is, the problem. And I can see that because I'm working for UN Women, I'm the regional director of UN Women for Europe and Central Asia, and I see that in so many countries, the legislation is there, the policy is there, the rhetoric is there, but the implementation is not there. There's a huge gap between what men say and what they do. And that is the problem we are dealing with, and need really to see how we can change. I don't know. I think how do we change this? We have to hold all governments to account. We have to hold the UN leadership to account. We have to hold the Security Council to account. And we have and who does that? It's mainly the civil society organizations. it's because I see people here from the labor union. It's the labor union. It's it's the media. It is women's organizations. It's all these people that really have to push for inclusion of women in all these processes. I just want to mention here because my background is I was in Afghanistan for 2 years, working there as a representative of UN Women. And in Afghanistan, if we look around there, we have, like in the UN, I think the presence there, it's a very big presence of the UN. It's like 33 agencies, funds and programs that are there. And most of the international communities or countries have embassies in Kabul, or the most important ones at least have embassies. But who are representing these, both the UN and the international community? It's men. In the UN, in the 33 funds and programs and agencies that were present in Afghanistan, we were only 2 women that were heading agencies. The rest were men. And all the ambassadors were men. Before I left, 3 months before I left Afghanistan, there was a Canadian female ambassador that came. That was the first one. And then, the international community, the UN is meeting with the Afghan government, and there comes the Afghan government with 2 women on board as ministers. And the international community is sitting there and saying, you have to include women. You have to ensure that women are where decisions are made. How, convincing is that to say that when the international community is, not walking the talk? It's teaching by preaching, but not by doing. And this is, we can never succeed in that way. If we don't, walk the talk, we won't see much improvement. So I don't have any magic formula how to change it. The only thing I know is that we need to, continue to talk about this, continue to push for this, continue to press our governments and international community and international organizations or whoever it is to ensure that women are included. And then again in Afghanistan, because women, what we were doing all the time, and now I sound a bit cynical, I guess. We are always saying, we need to train women. Let's train them. And because so they are ready to be part of peace negotiations, so they are really, competent to deal with this. And we are training the same women over and over again. We are training them. UN Women is training them. The United States is training them. ISAF is training them. Everybody is training these women, and they have been so well trained and they are so ready, but they are never, invited to the table. But what about all these men? What about training all these men? I see so many men around that have never been trained in, these issues. How do they know how to deal with this if they haven't been trained? And we need definitely to train, and it's very important to train the women, as they say. Let's train the men in dealing with these issues, so they really, know how to address this, and also really know how to have a gender perspective on these issues. I know there has been some of it, but if you compare it to the training of women, it is so little. So let's have that as my introductory remarks, but I can come into this discussion later on.
Thank you very much, Ingibjörg. Torun Tryggestad.
Thank you.
Your 5 minutes.
Yes. I have some good news to you when it comes to training of men. Because actually, PRIO is now involved in a new initiative together with the Finnish Crisis Management Initiative and UNDPA in training high-level personnel at the UN, meaning the SRSG, the special representatives of the Secretary General, the special envoys, etc. And the majority of them happens to be men. But what we do, we don't call it training, because we had a discussion, how will we manage to get these men to come to these trainings? So we call it seminar. And we have actually been quite successful in managing to get these men to our seminars. We have had 3 of them so far, and there's going to be a 4th one in Oslo in November. And we have about 20 people attending each of them, at least half of them men. We also involve women because we think it's important for the exchange of experience. And the good news is that many of these men actually are very, they acknowledge the importance, and they also see the relevance of this. But all of them say that, but we don't know how to do it. And I think men tend to think that this is so difficult, and I don't think it is. But we give them then ideas how to integrate gender language in peace agreements, how to can you go about identifying women in the conflict countries or in the conflict regions where you are. How can you collaborate with civil society? Because, I mean, women's organizations around the world have huge networks. And if you communicate with some of these big civil society organizations, they can help you identify relevant women, and then also the women that does not represent the governments or the rebel groups, but the grassroots in the countries in question. So that was a little bit of, what should I say, good news in terms of training these high-level men. So we'll see in a few years' time from now whether it has made any difference or not. Okay. Well, I think I also will continue a little bit where you left it in terms of also, what should I say, a bit of an optimistic perspective on this. Being a researcher, although I've been working quite close on both policymakers and more activist organizations, I've been trying to take a step back and analyze what I've been seeing and observing over the years. And I think there are two trends that can be observed. The first one is that I think we have come quite far in developing the normative framework. We have this resolution that you referred to, Resolution 1325, which was adopted in 2000. And then from 2008 and up until last year, we have had 6 more resolutions being adopted. Resolutions that are more specific, are more, what should I say, more demanding in a way, with more concrete language on how to go about doing this. There is much more of a political recognition, as you said. I think it's quite difficult now for high-level politicians to come to the Security Council and give statements without referring to this. And then you can say, okay, but it's only language. But I think it's important because the more people talk about it, the more it is recognized, and it's important with the political recognition. What we have also seen is that this is talked about in the Security Council in a different way. The first years after the resolution was adopted, it was treated only once a year in a separate discussion in October as a kind of celebration of the resolution, and nothing much really happened. But what we see now is that this is a topic that is being discussed throughout the year. There are now also separate discussions in the spring, focusing more particularly on sexual violence. And you see that the Women, Peace and Security agenda is being addressed in other thematic discussions, like when they discuss peace building. And you also see that it's more and more now being integrated into resolutions adopted by the Security Council on specific conflicts, or it could be mandates for a new peacekeeping operation. It's still not fully integrated, but there has been huge improvements over the last, I would say, 4 or 5 years. And what we also see is that I think I would say that it has now become an integrated part of the rhetoric on international peace and security matters. And I think this is a huge step forward, because if you go back to the late 1990s, it was unthinkable for the UN Security Council to address so-called women's issues when they were discussing international peace and security matters. It was regarded as something different, as something soft, that this is something that others have to deal with. But now it has been integrated, and it has also been defined as a global security imperative, that we need to implement this agenda, we need to involve women. But then, of course, that being said, there is still a long way to go. We have it now normatively acknowledged. We have all these new resolutions, but there is still a long way to go to its actual implementation on the ground. the second trend, I think, can be observed is that all these new resolutions that I mentioned, the majority of them are focusing on sexual violence. And this has also been a key focus in many of the debates at the UN Security Council. And we also see that many of the major powers in the world, when they want to discuss this, it's the sexual violence part of this broader agenda that they pick up on. And this summit in London that is actually taking place this week, as we speak, is also focusing on that. And I think it's very important that this is a topic that is lifted high on the agenda, because it's terrible what is happening to women. But at the same time, it worries me, because Resolution 1325, as I see it, the key message in that resolution is women's participation. That women must be empowered, that women must be involved in all decision-making processes at every level and at any issue that has to do with peace and security matters. And this is not happening. And I think it's quite difficult to do much about fighting or ending sexual violence against women unless you don't also focus on empowering women and strengthening gender equality and women's human rights. I don't think that we should separate between these two agendas. I think they should be interlinked, and that we should go back and focus on the key message of the resolution. And I was thinking of giving you some examples of the lack of women's involvement in peace processes, but you have already done so in terms of providing the figures, that only 3% of women in peace processes 2000 has actually signed or been signatories to peace agreements, and only 8% women have been participating in peace processes. Those figures are extremely low. And also, these figures we are not quite sure if they are really correct, because the researchers that came up with these figures in terms of deciding whether there were women participating or not, actually were looking at photos, because often you cannot see from the documents if there were women participating. So they were looking at photos, but you don't know if these women actually were involved. It could be that they happened to be there when the photo was taken, that these women actually were making coffee or something. So the figures might be even worse than what is now being referred to. So I think this is really worrying. And also the fact that I think you said that there were only 15% of women heading peacekeeping operations. The UN has only appointed one woman as a lead mediator or peace envoy, and that was last year with what's her name, Mary Robinson. Yeah, and I mean, it's now almost 14 years since Resolution 1325 was adopted, and the Secretary General has managed to appoint only one woman. I don't think that's a very good track record. And you were talking about leading by example. There is a story that my colleagues at the UN often refer to, and that was when the Secretary General went to Libya to meet with the first interim peace council, and he noticed that there were no women at the table, and he said to the leader of the peace council, "So where are the Libyan women?" And then he turned to the Secretary General and said, "So, Mr. Secretary General, with due respect, where are the women on your delegation?" So, I mean, it's really important that the international community, that UN member states also appoint women in these kinds of positions, so that we can lead by example. I was looking a little bit at the draft document and the recommendations or the demands that this document would like to come up with as an outcome document of this conference. And I think there was one thing that I would then like to pick up, because one of the demands is that the Nordic governments should argue or demand that there is a separate position being established at the UN focusing on women's participation, that there should be a special representative being appointed. And given what I've just said about looking at this in a, what should I say, in a holistic manner. I don't think that's the way to go about that. You have one special representative dealing with sexual violence and one special representative dealing with the, what should I say, more political agenda. I think that the UN should do what NATO has done, what the African Union has done, to appoint one person who is responsible for the full agenda, so that this is being looked at in an interconnected way. So I think that I will stop there, but this is something that we perhaps can discuss.
Tarja, you wanted to comment on the training and the seminars, right?
Yes, and,
Yes.
and some of the things. I started trying to identify the gaps, and both of you taking the advantage is now in front. So I would just say a few words about from the European perspective in terms of the advantages. First of all, I think the resolution is very, very important, of course. It's all the time being referred to in all European Parliament resolutions dealing with violence on women or conflicts, armed conflicts. It is always referred to. And it gives legitimacy for everybody to talk about these issues. So actually the women issues are involved. It's not only a rhetoric, but it also sort of is awareness and creating activities. So in this way, it's very good. The second thing, I agree on this question that the focus is on sexual violence, which should be. But especially if you look at the whole peace process and reconstruction and activities that are becoming more and more problematic. You can see in Iraq, the reconstruction failed. And you can see the same probably in Afghanistan in just a few years. So in the reconstruction phase, sexual violence is not so dominant as a perspective. And there you should focus on this everyday life, how to channel reconstruction funds also to women organizations, how to employ women in different kinds of cooperatives and so forth, so that the women are not just, particularly in Afghanistan, they are at home and maybe object to domestic violence. So you have to sort of try to see the working environment as well. And I'm a former Minister of Labor, so I think in those terms. And so I think that this question of sexual violence should be focused, but also there should be this other aspect of how to create the everyday life. In this sense, one of the problems when you see the reconstruction processes is the question of small women projects. Women projects are always very small and they don't need a lot of money, and it's microloans and the international organizations, they think in billions which are sent to the countries, and I think one of the things that should be taken into account is that in the funding following, for example, Afghanistan gets a lot of money right now. So it should be looked at, where do the funds go and who actually uses them. And special mechanisms are needed for small female entrepreneurs and small businesses and so forth, which do not exist. So it's difficult. It's much easier to send to the National Bank huge amounts of fund and construct the roads and not the... I think one of the most important examples of the kind of reconciliation resources women have is in Bosnia. I think there's the case where women that had their men in prisons, from both sides, both from the Serbian and the Bosnian side, they cooked together food for all the prisoners. So in this way, women have this psychological ability to build a bridge at a time when the men maybe still have the enemy picture. But I wanted also to comment on the training of men. It's true that there's this project you are with the crisis management initiative in Finland, but also the Finnish government has made an action plan for this resolution 1325, and it requires that all Finnish men that participate in peace projects or in peace crisis managements are trained in gender violence and thinking about gender and so forth. I don't know how successful it has been, but but they are trained also. The final thing I want to make is the comment is about political responsibility. I think whatever we do in the peace process, we have to guarantee that the political power after is shared also by women. And I think one of the very, very fantastic examples is Rwanda. Rwanda, I think today is the only place where the parliament actually has a majority of women. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Ingeborg, you wanted to comment on this?
Yeah, there were actually two things I want to comment on, and I didn't want to forget. First of all, was the issue raised here about sexual violence as a key focus. That's a trend now in this whole women, peace and security issue. It's focusing on sexual violence against women, which is, like you said, a very important, thing to deal with and address, because we have seen how rape is used as a tool in conflicts. It's a weapon in a conflict and used to dishonor and destabilize whole communities. It's a easy and cheap way to destabilize whole communities. So it's used, and it's really important to address it. But then again, I say like you, it's a bit concerning if all the focus goes on violence against women, because you cannot deal with violence against women in isolation. Mm-hmm. If you are going to deal with violence against women and really address it in an effective way, you have to empower women, politically, socially, economically, culturally, in every way. You really have to focus on how to empower women in these societies so you can deal with violence. And now I'm again coming back to Afghanistan, because this is what I saw very clearly in Afghanistan. We have all heard these horrendous stories about violence against women in Afghanistan, and how, it's terrible. It's actually terrible, and it's an epidemic almost. And the international community is really willing to work on this, both on the protection and prevention. And it was easy, in a way, to get funds to deal with violence against women. But women's economic empowerment, it's much more difficult. And everything that has to do with or political empowerment, it's much more difficult. And in a way, it is a bit, helping these poor women instead of empowering them, and then you're victimizing women instead of looking at them as actors and really think, how can you make them more or stronger as actors? So it really has to go hand in hand, and it is important. Then again, I also want to talk about, empowering women and including women in all processes. And there, again, I'm coming to the role of the international community, because when the international community is involved in one way or another, then it has to assert the right of women to be included in political processes in conflict or post-conflict countries. Because what happens? Let's take Libya, let's take Egypt. Women were participated along with men in the protests. They were participating in ousting the leaders of these countries, be it in Egypt or Libya. They were as active as men. They were standing side by side in the squares, in the protest. But then when the political processes started, they were simply sidelined. They were not part of these processes. And now we are seeing, I'm afraid, a bit the same thing happening in Ukraine. Women were very active there in the protests. Now the political processes are starting to, and the national dialogues are starting, and then I'm afraid, women are again being sidelined. And it's really important exactly at this stage to make sure that they are included. When the process, the political process and the dialogue starts, then they have to be participating actively. And they are there, and they are willing, they are ready. But they are simply not invited.
Now, I have a question that relates a bit to the appearance question. Like you were saying, you know, it's not enough. You have to practice what you preach. Now, it says in the final document, or the draft of it, the role of the Nordic countries has changed, in the sense that instead of being leading in peace processes and peacekeeping, it's become more focused on military intervention and participation in actual war. Do you agree with that? And is it a bad thing? Is it a way for the Nordic countries to become more important, to become bigger players, to get a more attention, or is it a wrong turn? Do you agree with what it says in the draft of the final document?
I can only speak for what I've seen in Norway, and I think it's the observation is correct, because if we go back to the 80s, Norway was actually in many ways a superpower when it comes to contributing military forces to UN peacekeeping, and that was, I mean, through peacekeeping forces, but particularly after the intervention in Afghanistan, all the military resources have been now focused on Afghanistan, so we hardly contribute to the more classical UN peacekeeping operations anymore. I think we have maybe 5 military observers at a time, and that's really nothing. Of course, the government argues that this is contributions to UN peacekeeping because the operation in Afghanistan has a UN mandate. But I think that's, well, it's a matter of discourse, I think. But I think it will be very interesting to see what will happen now when we all withdraw from Afghanistan, because the Secretary General of the UN has been asking Norway again and again and again, please contribute forces. And then the message has been, no, I'm sorry, we are spending all our resources in Afghanistan, we cannot contribute. But they cannot continue with that kind of argumentation anymore. And I think it was last week I was at a meeting sorry, at the Ministry of Foreign Affairs where the minister had invited representatives from civil society, from research, to share with us his thoughts about the new Norwegian strategy for the implementation of Resolution 1325. They've just started to work on that now. And he actually then listed up contributions to peacekeeping as something that would now be very important. But he didn't go into detail. But I think that they are probably now thinking that we would probably now need to contribute to more classical UN peacekeeping in the years to come. So it will be interesting to see. Yeah.
I think it's also a question of the changing nature of wars, that before you had more peacekeeping, there were sort of frontiers and you could see where you could keep the peace.
Yes.
But today it's more, the armed conflict is everywhere. And so the military has a new role in maintaining order. And I think in this way the military has a new task, and it's maybe quite natural for the Nordic countries, for example, in the Afghan ISAF forces to try to maintain order. And I think in a way this maintaining order is an advantage for women. If you have order, the women can organize, the girls can go to schools, but if you have this disorder, the insecurity, fear, it's very, very difficult to organize everyday life. So in this way, I feel that the military's work in these cases, in these wars which are everywhere, is really a sort of a good for women. Then the question is how you differentiate between the military and the civilian work, and whether you. I think there's a debate in the peace movement that whether you should have the military and the civilian separately, the Red Cross here and the peacekeeping forces there, or whether you should allow them to merge, because the military often needs to protect the Red Cross, and the Red Cross needs the help from the military in trying to find out where to go and so forth. So this, I think, is a very, very interesting question. Should the military and the civilian organizations be kept separately, or could they work together in synergy? I think many of the civilian organizations have said it's a problem for them when there's an acute conflict, because if they become parts in the war, then they are not allowed to go to places where they are needed. Syria was an example. There was this question of this beleaguered city where Red Cross and other help organizations couldn't even enter. It was changed afterwards, but when you consider these help organizations as parties in the conflict, then it's difficult. So I think I would like actually to raise this question for the audience also, if you have any experiences, because I think it's difficult to see what is the answer. Maybe it's local. Maybe it's a question of if the local situation is such that the military can work with the organization. Maybe it's fine. Maybe there should be separation.
I also have a question, because I see some kind of a contradiction here. When you say it's all in place, the policy, the legislation, it's all there. All the women, we've got, from what I understand from you, and also here to play a little bit of the devil's advocate, that you have women in line, trained and ready to take over and take their spot. So why doesn't it happen if everything is in place, legislation and policy, will, rhetoric, words on paper, and a line of women which are trained and ready for it? Is it then maybe time, I mean, are they waiting for someone to ask them? Is it maybe important for them just to step up and grab and make place for them? Do we need more incentives from themselves, or why doesn't this connect?
Should I start? At least when it comes to the high level or the top level positions, I think the way recruitment is conducted is a problem, and particularly if you look at the UN, there is a tendency of you recruit men that has had high level positions in their home countries, often being a state leader perhaps, or a minister of foreign affairs. And when these men first have been recruited, they tend to be kind of, they go in circle. They get one position and then are offered a new one. And often the kind of experience asked for is the more, what should I say, experience from the hardcore politics in their national countries, like foreign affairs or defense. Yeah. And I remember I discussed this a little bit with Elisabeth Rehn last year when we met in Finland, and she said when she was asked to take on this job as special rapporteur on, wasn't it human rights for the Balkans, she was called by the Secretary General, and he said he was asking her because of her background as Minister of Defense. And she said to me, you know, I felt that my experience as a Minister of Social Welfare was much more relevant than being a Minister of Defense. So she said that I think we need to do something about the way we think, that we need to look for other kinds of experiences. Also because, as you said, conflicts have changed. You need leaders with different kinds of experiences than what we have been looking for so far. So I think we are, not we, the international community or those involved in recruitment are a bit old-fashioned and conservative in their thinking. So I think we need to change that trend. When it comes to, if we go back, down to the local level, in conflict countries, I think there are many women that would love to participate. But for many women and women's organizations, it's a question of lack of resources. Many of them actually don't manage to get to the places where peace mediation is taking place. So they need funding. And travel. I mean, it's often as simple as that.
Maybe I can jump in here. I think it's right. It has a lot to do with recruitment, because when it's come to recruiting senior staff in this area, the requests that are made and the requirements that are asked for are, things that are more likely that men have than women. So, and also when men are first recruited, they have their own networks. They know other men, women who are recruited, they know other women, and they know about women that can and are willing. But the men, they don't know them. This is the same in this, area as in all other areas. It's just we have different networks, and we use them, when we are in higher position. So it is important to have, equal men and women in these positions. That's one thing. The other thing is that once they have been appointed, let's say, for example, negotiators that have been appointed by the UN, they definitely have the responsibility to ensure that women are part of the negotiation team of the different the conflicting partners. So that's their responsibility and role to ensure that women are also included in the negotiation teams. And that's one of the things that we really need to push for and hold them to account. And I want to mention one resolution that was approved last year by the Security Council, called Resolution 2122. They all have numbers, these resolutions. And that is actually a very important resolution, because in this resolution, the Security Council itself decides to be accountable and to make commitment to collect information every year from the different, shall we say, from different sides, what are they really doing to include women? What are those who they have appointed, for example, what are they doing, be it the special representatives, or be it the mediators or negotiators, what are they doing to really include women? So this is a new resolution. I think it was in September or October last year it was approved. And this can be used as a tool to hold the Security Council to account. And they can call for information, and they can see what is being done to include women.
Before I give you the word, Tarja, I just want to add something for you to answer, because you've been talking about this view that, yes, we can support women, small operations, with little money, whereas the big funds go to big construction companies, etc. And you said we need to put the money in everyday life. I'd like to know a little bit better what do you mean by that. And just a point on that, on the recruitment, because I think it's like that in every country. The terms of recruitment, even just in a company or whatever, it's if a woman has run, let's say, a big NGO for years, she's been the head of the NGO, she's been running it maybe with thousands of members, keeping everything going. The bottom line is in green, is in black. Not in red. And all the views that you have in an NGO, that is of much less importance than a man that has been working in an office as an executive director of something with 10 people under him. But running an NGO doesn't count anything. With Capacent or Gallup or those that do the recruitment, nothing. It's zero. No, you don't know how to govern people. You don't know how to run anything, because you've only been running an NGO, but not a company which deals with real things, with money. It's this attitude which I think you are touching upon now when you're talking about the recruitment. So this is what I wanted to throw in with you, Tarja, to add to your answer on this.
Okay, I will first address the question you're saying. Well, we have all the legislation is there, and the thinking is there, and everybody can talk about it, and why is not anything happening on the ground? I think we are coming into a phase where the problems are much more difficult. It's not only a question of resolutions, but it's a question, for example, if you meet the Muslim world in Arab Spring, in Libya, in Egypt. I have followed Catherine Ashton when she has went to Libya and to Egypt, and she comes there and she starts talking about women's participation, and also has some money to give to the governments for increasing women's participation. And the governments don't do anything. They laugh. They think, well, why do we talk about women? We have this revolution, and we have to find new leaders, and we have to we get a new constitution, a new parliament, and why does she talk about these women? And I think it's very difficult to in the next phase to change the thinking of Muslim men in this situation. And I think one should follow now what happens in the countries, Tunisia, Morocco, Libya, and Egypt, and try to compare to see. I think it is better in Tunisia and Morocco, and worse in Egypt, obviously. So international comparisons on how to take the next step for getting women more involved, and how to also allocate for the highly qualified women places in society in these fields. And the second question for you, how to give the money to women? We know how to do it. The Nordic countries are specialists on this. They can establish banks on the ground. The Nordic Investment Bank is a very good example. They did this in the Baltic states. They establish banks on the ground which only fund women entrepreneurs, for example. And they have mechanisms, criteria for funding women entrepreneurs. They allocate the money. It's like in South America, the savings and loan banks were established for people to get them to build houses. So you give these microloans, you do only this, and you evaluate them and try to see what happens. I don't know how many of you have heard about the way Americans gave money to Karzai. It was a question of having luggage, cash in luggage which were left in Karzai's office. And in these cases, none of this cash ever reached any women. So there are mechanisms, they are well known. The Nordic countries are very good at this and should try to do it also now.
No, I realize I could maybe add a little bit to this, because I think what we really need to think about is maybe more approach the security issue as a soft security issue, as a comprehensive security. So we really look at how can we even prevent conflicts from happening in the first place? How can we prevent extremism to develop? And I think, many of this, we have all kind of, early warning indicators, and we tend not to look at them. We tend not to pay attention to them because we are so busy in dealing with these, hardcore conflicts where we are spending a lot of money. But if we would do that, maybe we could spend monies on social issues, on creating, more equality in societies, instead of, spending. I think the U.S. has spent $3 trillion in anti-terrorist measures. If we spend only a part of this in all kind of social investment, that could maybe be part of preventing extremism to develop, I think that would be a good investment. But that's one thing. The other thing I just didn't want to forget here is, because we were talking about the final document from here, and the UN, and I must admit that I haven't yet read it, but you were saying that there's something about a recommendation that the UN has a special representative on what?
On women's right to participate and act in peace and security issues.
Okay, then I because this is a Nordic conference, I would like to mention an old idea that I had from the days when I was Minister of Foreign Affairs, and that was that the Nordic countries together had a special envoy on women in conflict areas. Why don't we, the Nordic, together have such an envoy? Why do we need to go to the UN? I think it has a resonance, and it has some weight if it comes from the Nordic countries. And I know they have separate, foreign services, all the Nordic countries, but there must be a way that they could, do this together and have that person and having all the Nordic countries behind that kind of a post, I think would make it quite influential. And then it needs to be, of course, addressing conflict issues in conflict countries in a very comprehensive way. So I'll just throw this idea here to the
The rapporteur has written it down. We'll bring it to the text committee, right, Jon? Just for you that maybe came a little late, there are some pieces of paper here. If there's something that you think is missing from the final paper, you can write it there and give it to Jon. Just last question before we get questions from the public. Because you've talked quite a lot about the focus on sexual violence. I interviewed one of the Red Cross. Her name is Pascal Mays Wagner. She's been out in the field for ages. Now she's working in Geneva. And I just asked her, do you think the world is becoming a better place? You know, after all those years that the Red Cross has been working and the UN. I mean, we've got around 40 armed conflicts, horrible sexual violence that is used systematically and all that. And she actually said, I can't really say that. It's maybe not getting much worse, but I can't say it's getting any better. So, I mean, the resolution 1325 is from the year 2000. It's almost 14 years where this focus has been on fighting against sexual violence in armed conflict. But we can't really say that it has been reduced or we've found a way to prevent it. Yes, the Red Cross, there are a lot of institutions that are helping the victims, but pure prevention or some deterrent, we haven't really got anywhere there, have we? Or what do you think?
Well,
Sorry, long question.
Yeah. I agree with you, and I can tell you this is a huge debate also in academia, because also at PRIO we have colleagues who are doing research on statistics and are counting numbers, and you have this Uppsala database, and all these, many of them guys, come up with new figures every year, and they get headlines in the newspapers telling that the world has become a safer place because there are now fewer conflicts around. And whereas me and some of my colleagues in my research group, we try to argue that, well, there might be fewer conflicts if we count and use the figures that they use, like if there has been less than 125 people killed, and they look at armed groupings and formal wars, but the fact is that there seems to be much more rape around, and what the research, we have a research project looking at sexual violence in conflict, and it's been now in function for 2 years, I think, and there are some research findings coming out of it, and one is that in conflicts or in conflict areas where rape has been prevalent during war, it seems to continue into the post-war phase. So if you go there and ask the women, they can't tell much difference from when the formal war ended and from the situation here and now. So I think it's important that we discuss how we define a conflict, how we define peace, how we define security, and more focus on human security, perhaps, than state security.
I think you can say that the world has become a safer place for soldiers, because there are very few soldiers who die, and will be even fewer in the future. But what happens is that this civil collateral damage is getting more and more, and it's involving larger groups of the population in any individual conflict. You can see the situation in Iraq now. It's really very, very dangerous.
So we can open up for questions from the public. We have a pink shirt which is going to run around. What I'm going to do, because it's a limited time, I would like you to write down the questions that are pointed to you, and we'll take 3 or 4 questions in a row. Okay.
Thank you. My name is Emmike Roos. I'm from 1325 Policy Group. And I have a question because Ingebjørg was touching upon 2122 and the role of the Security Council and the accountability in the UN. Because what has been a problem for many years is the reporting back to the Security Council from the different UN missions. It has varied a lot. Some missions have been really good at reporting on women, peace and security, while others have had very lacking reporting, and this of course affects the work of the Security Council. And so I'm wondering if you're seeing any changes in this in the last years, and especially after the adoption of 2122. I mean, it's a very new resolution, but have you seen any impact straight away on sort of the demands by the Security Council on the missions to actually have adequate reporting on 1325 and women, peace and security? Thank you.
Thank you. My name is Josefin Karlsson. I'm the Secretary General of the Swedish section of Women's International League for Peace and Freedom, IKFF på svenska. And I have a somewhat broader question than Emiki's. My organization said when it was founded, one of the statements it made was that women can never be protected under the conditions of modern warfare. And that was during the First World War. And so their strategy for this was to work for prevention of conflict, different types of crisis management, disarmament. And this is also quite a large topic under the Beijing Platform for Action. But here we've focused quite a lot on how to get the system to work for women rather than questioning the system as such. Ingeborg, you touched upon it when it comes to resources, for instance. But it's very clear in the Beijing Platform for Action and that we're talking about a culture of peace, prevention. I mean, the best way to prevent sexual violence and conflict is to prevent conflict. So I would love to have some comments on that, and also perhaps link it to what you've also touched upon, the different types of conflicts, but also war on terrorism. How has that affected women since the Beijing Platform for Action, and should we be updating our demands when it comes to resources and so on? Thank you.
Good morning, and thank you all for this. My name is Elvar. I'm coming from the State Labor Union in Iceland. Been working there on equality matters things, and also with background in peace movements. I have a few questions. What shall I say? We got this UN resolution in 2000. Just afterwards, 2001 hit us. And in the years followed, there was we got the Geneva Treaty on Human Rights disconnected. So what effect does that have on this resolution, that you have this treaty on human conduct, on conducting warfare and things, and it has been totally disregarded of major powers, and they sometimes try to rewrite it, and then they pick up on this one aspect of this resolution, that is sexual violence, because that's very popular with the media, but they disregard everything else. So I don't see the progress. Where are we really in human rights on the whole? What should we have? Yes, it's about women in, you see women in top positions. It still seems to me that most of the women that make it to the platform, they are trying to outdo men. It's not only Rice and Thatcher, but we don't see women making the case for real progress. They just do the man's work. And even they are in good places, they co-opt with the secrecy in the military and the foreign policies, and then I would just say, how does that prevent this special issue that we are having here? How does that affect all this secrecy in the military, that women, they are not allowed to address, and foreign policies in the Nordic countries, for instance? We have the rift between, as was addressed here before, change in Nordic policies in peace agenda. Norway especially, but we should address Sweden. Okay. Okay. And no. No, let's.
Thank you. My name is Lotta Hedström. I'm a former parliamentarian in Sweden, and I was also the chairperson for Swedish Afghanistan Committee, providing development aid in Afghanistan. So I very, very much can testify what Ingebjörg is saying about the 1325 work, because I was in connection with parliamentarian women last year trying to promote this. But I wanted to partly try to answer the question that Tarja put to us. Whether development aid providers think that soldiers also can be development worker. And I think that is connected to the discussion you just held, the concept of what is security. Because, I mean, the Swedish Afghanistan Committee, which is a big provider, we have a quite big amount of development aid. We stay away from those, weapon people, soldiers, because they make us a target. That's more, we are more exposed for violence if we are close to them. But, the concept of what constitutes security and how to keep security, that's a crucial issue. And that's also connected to what you recently talked about, why women do not continue to get involved after peace as politicians. That is because the political arena is a very, very masculine arena. It's, the basic concept is competition. And if you're not into competition, not into weapon, not into security policy as it used to be defined, then you're not interesting. So those things go together. So we have to redefine what is security, and that's how women ultimately can come into the arena to establish security and then to take part in running a peaceful society. So stay away from soldiers. That's my answer, Tarja.
Last question there in the back. You're writing it all down.
Okay. Thank you. I want to begin with that. You are saying that it's difficult even for the Nordic women to be a real part of the politics. Then it's worse when we talk about Afghanistan or Arab Spring. When we see, you were talking about empowerment of women. I agree, the education, employing and that. But when we see Egyptian women have a history. They are educated, they are employed, but they are not there in the policy decision making. That what is the thing we can catch sorry, Swedish. What is the thing we can do for women that can do them better or included in the decision making? I think if we talk about the funding of these countries or women organizations, I think there we can begin to make women stronger, and then they can go over. Thank you.
Hello, my name is Hedve, and I'm coming from Iceland, from the private market, labor market there. I was wondering, I can catch that there's the policy, the legislation, and everything is there. You need to put the power in, and as I noticed, to the top men positions. And I was just wondering if it could be possible to just turn this around and sell these men in these top positions, what the worth of one woman at the labor market is. Indeed, I know this has been done when calculating risk analysis for natural hazards, for example. So I just wanted to put it into the discussion and try to turn this around. And we know that because it's all about funding. And if we calculate it and sell them that this is a worth of a lot of money, which will go direct into the economic of the country, so maybe we can turn this around. So, thank you.
Yeah, I can start with the last question because I think that's quite interesting. You can approach this agenda in two ways. You can either point to that this is a rights issue, I mean this women, peace and security agenda, or you can use arguments of efficiency. And from experience, at least when you deal with men, it seems that the efficiency argument is much more effective than focusing on the rights arguments. And this is a huge debate, whether you should do that or not. But I know, for instance, that the World Bank is now, I think they put up a project group that is going to look at the cost of leaving women out in a post-conflict phase in peace-building processes. And I think that will be quite interesting to see what comes out of that. And I think if they can really put evidence on the table that this is extremely costly, that we don't tap on these resources, I think that could be something really interesting. And I know that also the previous government in Norway used this argument all the time, that after women entered the labor force in Norway and the high level we have now of women in the workforce, actually their production and the tax revenue has a greater value than the revenue from our oil industry. And that's something that, wow, people out there in the world really
use it a lot.
Yes, they raise their eyebrows, and it can't be true. And yes, it is true. So I think it's if you can come with those kinds of arguments, it's really something. Let's see, was there anything else that I've felt like? Well, I think I need to think a little bit.
Yeah, okay. There are several questions. I don't know if I can touch upon all of them. First of all, about reporting back to the Security Council, that it was asked if that has improved, since the resolution 2122. And as you said, it was adopted so recently that we cannot say whether that has happened or not. But the thing is, and that is one of the things I think can have an impact, is that in October 2015, next year, there will be a high-level review of 1325, and it will be the centerpiece of this review will be a global study that will be submitted by the Secretary General to the Security Council, and UN Women is coordinating this review, and they will look at trends over time, since the adoption of 1325, and see if things have changed, and then where and how. So this will be I think it can be quite important when this review will be submitted in October next year. So let's see, what comes out of that. Then about questioning the system, if we shouldn't question the system instead of dealing just with how we can involve more women in all these processes. How can we prevent conflicts in the first place? And I think there you're touching upon a very delicate and difficult issue. But because when we look at conflict situations, what is common to all conflict situations is that they are intimately connected to patriarchy. That's what they are. And they are involved the clash of masculinities. It's, always clash of masculinities in one way or another. So that is what we then need to deal with and address. How do we change the perception of masculinities as it is now in our world today? And how do we how do we deal with that? And that's an issue, that is quite complicated to deal with, but we cannot shy away from it, I guess. And I think, because I mentioned here that I think we have a lot of early warning indicators, and I think one of the early warning indicators of violent extremism is, always has to do with violence against women. In countries where violence against women is, let's say, accepted or not addressed, and where there is a lot of attack on sexual and reproductive rights of women, then that is an early warning indicator that something is likely to happen there. And what makes me concerned now is all these right-wing groups in Europe that are coming up, or the ultra-right-wing groups, and that's what they are. They are xenophobic, they are homophobic, and most of them are also, very much against this, or are uncomfortable with sexual and reproductive rights of women. So this is concerning, and this is an early warning indicator. It tells us that we need to address this. We really need to address this. Just to mention it, because we are so often talking about this when it comes to the Islamic world, but we should also look closer to ourselves and see what's happening in Europe. Women in top position. Some of them are just doing the men's work and are doing it, quite effectively. But the thing is, we cannot never take, individual women that go to top positions. We need to think about the critical mass of women. We need to have a critical mass of women everywhere where decision making is taking place, because one woman here and there doesn't make a matter of difference. But if there's a critical mass, it usually does, and that is important. Then, how are women included in this peace process? I think maybe the best way to include them is, on one hand side, to really that the mediators, the negotiators, that they have the clear mandate to include women, but then it's by inviting civil society to these negotiations, because I think through civil society organizations, women are more likely to come that way into this. And I think also when we invite civil society, then we are more likely to have a peace that will shall we say, be sustainable. So I think it is quite important. And then, you have answered the question about women's worth in the labor market, so I am not going to address that.
Tarja, famous last words.
Yes, and very short. I will only answer one of the questions, this about changing the system. It's true that we take the system now and we try to reduce women violence, we try to integrate in existing peace processes, and why don't we prevent conflicts? And I think there are two things we know how to prevent conflicts. It's good. Sexual violence against women is a good indicator, but I think the best indicator for how to prevent armed conflicts and conflicts emerging is to look at the young men who are unemployed. There's a very strong correlation between the unemployment of young men and potential conflict. So and this is again the labor minister talking, getting the young men to work is the most important way to prevent conflict. It has been used systematically only once, as far as I know. It's in Dagestan. When the Chechen conflict was at its height, the president of Dagestan said, how do we avoid that this conflict emerges also in Dagestan? And he said, we do it the way that all the young men get a plot of land and they build their own housing. And then they have to get married. So he actually established these young men in Dagestan in a family situation with their own house, with interests. And I don't think you can use this everywhere. But getting the young men in work is the most important criteria for prevention of conflicts. The second thing, on the country level, on the state level, is the question that we know from European Union that peace is dependent on economic relations and social relations. We have had peace for 70 years. And this means that you should not isolate any countries. What we are doing now with Russia is very, very dangerous. We are isolating Russia. The EU is saying no contacts, nobody meets anyone. And we are even calling into question all all projects that have to do with the cooperation. The EU delegation in Moscow is completely not able to do anything because everything is at a standstill. When you have a conflict, you cannot isolate the one part of the conflict. You need to have everybody in the peace table. You need to talk to everyone, and isolation is a very bad thing. Then just one more question about empowering women. I think it's a difficult question for us Nordic women, I think, because we like to empower and we have this, and we know the daycare centers, and we have this kind of equality and all these questions. I have met 2 examples which sort of were raised some thoughts in my... I was doing studies about military conversion in the arms industry in Russia, and I was interested how the women who worked in the arms production, how they actually felt when the Cold War was over and they were going to transfer their production into peace and civil society. And I met with the women and interviewed them, and I had the preconceived idea that they would like to work with baby food lines and washing machines and things like that rather than producing arms. And it was very astonishing that the women in the military industry in Russia wanted to continue producing arms. And why? It's because that's what they were trained to do, that's what they were sort of expected to do, and it had carried out a lot of prestige. So even the women are sort of, if you want to empower them, they have to do it themselves. And I worked a lot with Iran lately, and I went to Iran in December, and I talked to the feminists. If there's a country which is very interesting from the empowering women point of view, is Iran, because they are educated women, and they have actually been repressed in this theocratic system. And I talked to the feminist groups there, and I said, well, how do you plan to change the system of this kind? And you know what they were doing? They were studying the Quran to see if they could reinterpret Quran in some ways which would produce a different understanding of the role of women in society. So it's not so easy to come from the outside. They have to empower themselves. And then you can look at the preconditions in some way.
Thank you very much. Thank you for participating. I again remind you of the little pieces of paper, because not everything, of course, could be answered here. Not every idea may be got down. So Jon here takes those pieces of papers, takes them to the text committee, which is then putting together the final paper, the final document, which is going to be the resolution of this conference, and will be presented on Sunday. So please, if there's something that you feel is missing or you want to add, this is your guy. Thank you so much, Torun, Ingibjörg, og Tarja, for your participation. And the second half of the Peace and Security seminar, the B part, will be here next door at 2 p.m. and that will be in Scandinavian. Thank you.